take our breaths away with its glow.
Whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. I'm Maria Thompson Corley. If that quote from Philippians resonated with you, stay tuned. I'd love to introduce you to intriguing, creative people whose light is making our world a lovelier place. Welcome to Finding Beauty.
To The Raindrops on the Roses by today's guest, Dr. Jeffrey Dana Hicks. Dr. Hicks is a pianist, composer, performer, lecturer, recording artist, arranger, and conductor, and a musician, obviously, with many, many talents. In February of 2002, the Jeffrey Hicks Quartet entertained hundreds of guests at the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston to celebrate Senator Edward M. Kennedy's 70th birthday in an evening celebration which also featured cellist Yo-Yo Ma. Also, in June of 1990, the Jeffrey Hicks Trio, including saxophonist Bobby Tynes, entertained a large crowd at the John F. Kennedy Library. One of the honored guests included Nelson Mandela, in addition to Senator Edward M. Kennedy, so obviously they were a favorite of Edward M. Kennedy. And one of the afternoon's performers was Stevie Wonder, so wow, I wish I could have been there. Dr. Hicks is a graduate of the New England Conservatory of Music in composition, also attended the University of Massachusetts, where he received an MM in conducting, and also he went to Andover Newton Theological School, where he got a Master's of Divinity. More recently, he graduated from the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary with a doctorate in ministry, and that was in 2009. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and we're going to talk more about his childhood, which was very interesting. And he has performed and continues to perform as a singer and pianist at most of the major Boston hotels, including the Westin Hotel, the Ritz-Carlton, the Meridian, and there's just a who's who of really great hotels. He's also conducted several choral groups, including the New England Conservatory Youth Chorale, the Rosie's Place Jazz Choir, the Nativity Prep Boys Choir of Roxbury, and many more. Okay, so that gives you I don't want to leave this out. He's performed in places like Boston's Jordan Hall, Symphony Hall, the Hatch, Shell, the Chai, is that wrong? Did I pronounce that wrong? Psy Performance Center, Carnegie Hall, and the White House, before congressmen, presidents, and several international dignitaries. Okay, I finally got through that. So I'm so excited to be talking to you. Now, the part that I skipped because I wanted you to tell me more about it was your very interesting childhood. So can you fill us in on that?
Sure. I was born in St. Louis in 1954, and that was during the Eisenhower administration. My dad was the first African-American to be hired as a newspaper reporter in St. Louis in 1949. So he was a trailblazer. And it was a Jewish man, Sam Klein, who helped him. He was, I think, one of the editors at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and he insisted that they hire my dad, and it was great. And Dad got to interview a lot of people, including Martin Luther King, and I think one time during the 50s, Maria Callas. And then in the 60s, my father was assigned as a diplomat in the Foreign Service, so that's why we moved to Berlin. So the reason that Dad was assigned to Germany was because during the Korean War, he was in the army, and he was stationed not in Korea, but in Germany. And he told me that in the 2 years he was in Germany, he just studied every night, every chance he had a free moment. He just absorbed German. So by the 60s, he spoke fluent German, and so that's why they hired him as an information officer for USIA, which was the United States Information Agency. And so we moved to Berlin when I was 7, and I took piano lessons. But being in the Foreign Service, you know, you have to go wherever they send you. So we were there a few years. We were there about 3 years, and then, well, actually, I'll say this. President Kennedy came to Berlin, and, of course, made this famous speech, Ich bin ein Berliner. And later on that day, he gave like 5 different speeches, I think, and the last one was where my dad worked at the U.S. mission. So I got to shake his hand when I was a little 9-year-old Cub Scout. I had my Cub Scout uniform, and we were in the front row, and then my brother was there, and he asked the president for his autograph. He said he was sorry, but he wouldn't have enough time to do that, but he said it was good to see us. So we got to see him as little boys, and that made quite an impression. And of course, later that same year, he was assassinated, so it was devastating for all of us. And then I think one other kind of quick story. My father was good friends with Willy Brandt, who was the mayor of Berlin. And just after President Kennedy's death, when President Johnson was in office, they assigned my father, they wanted him to go to Africa. So we moved to Liberia in 64, I think it was. So just before we moved, Willy Brandt had invited us over to his office, and he was talking to us and telling my father, you know, what a great job he had done, and he was going to miss him, and he enjoyed his friendship with my father. And he said, I'm glad you all were able to come today, because tomorrow I've got to fly to Washington and see Lyndon. And so my 9-year-old ears heard that. I said, do you mean Lyndon like President Johnson? He said, yes. And so I asked him if I could get his autograph. And lo and behold, in about a month after we had moved to Africa, I get this package in the mail, the President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So I've had President Johnson's autographs ever since I was 10 years old.
Wow.
So that was kind of wild. And it was in Africa, actually. It was in Monrovia. We lived in Liberia, and the capital city is Monrovia. As you know, it was founded by American slaves. That's why they named the capital Monrovia, after President James Monroe, who gave them permission to leave. And it was in Monrovia that I started composing music. I just started making up little melodies in my head, and my dad told me that I was a composer and keep up the good work, and he was very proud of me. And that was when I first really got into making up tunes. And then I seriously considered composing when I was 16, because by then we had left Germany. My family moved back to Germany. And we were there for another 2 years when I was 14 and 15, and that's when I won the Steinway piano competition. And I played Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, and I won the top prize, but there's a little tangential circumstance associated with it. They felt that I wasn't good enough to get the number 1 prize, so they gave nobody the first prize. They gave me the second prize, so I was the winner, but I wasn't the first prize winner. So I was the second prize winner, and then there were third prize winners. So my teacher was furious about that.
I always thought that was stupid. I mean, I've heard of other places doing that, saying, you know, they're not awarding a first prize, and that's just kind of ridiculous. Anyway.
Yeah, well, no, it was just, it was the way it was, but I could care less. I was just thrilled that out of all these kids, I was able to get recognized.
Yeah.
And my teacher was like, I adored her. Her name was Elizabeth Dunya Sinderman, and she told some of the other kids, I found this out later actually, that she was like the 4th generation of piano students of Franz Liszt. So I guess that makes me and our colleagues the 5th generation. So there are a couple who have gone on to become concert pianists. I know Babette Hierholzer, who lives in New York. She's from Berlin, and but she plays all over the world now. So we left Germany around the end of 69, 70, and then I went to school in Washington for a little bit, and then I begged Dad to let me go to a prep school. It was a real culture shock moving from Germany to inner city Washington, D.C. So that took some getting used to, and I didn't handle that very well. So Dad was really nice enough to send me to Blair Academy in Blairstown, New Jersey. And that's where I really got serious about composing. And my teacher at the time was a man named Nevitt Bartow, and we all lived on campus. It was a boarding school, so I would go to his house and practice on his piano every day. And I would play melodies that I had composed, and he said, "Are any of these written down?" I said, "No." And so he literally grabbed my hand, started making me write down everything. And so I have always been grateful to him, and I promised him before he died that I would write 12 sets of 12 preludes in honor of him. He was still alive at the time, and but he had leukemia, and he died probably I don't know, maybe a couple of years after that. He died when I had just gotten into New England Conservatory. So that's a long answer. I'm sorry about all that.
No, that's okay. That sums up a lot of things. So I mean 12 sets of 12. That's a lot.
I just recently finished, maybe like a year ago. It took me a long time because when I was in college, I promised him I'd do it, and I started it, but I didn't really, I was writing other things because I had assignments when I was in school, and then when you get older, you sort of put things like that on the shelf, and you don't really follow up on it. But he was such a tremendous influence. I mean, even though he was literally dying from this illness, he was so full of life, and he used to drive me from New Jersey to Manhattan to meet his teacher, Ludmila Ulela, who was the composition chairman back then in the early 70s at Manhattan School of Music. And so I played my pieces for her, and she also confirmed that I needed to make sure I wrote everything down. And back then, of course, we did it by hand. Now I'm so thankful for computers. I can write all this music, on the computer with a click of a mouse. So it makes it a lot easier. But he was a tremendous influence. But I finished the whole series probably about 2 years ago.
I mean, that was real dedication because I said 144 pieces. That's a lot of pieces.
It is. It was something that, I didn't really even think about. I had to do it. It was, it was just instinctive that I would do this for him and in memory of him.
Sure.
He was so out of the box. Here was this man who was classically trained, and I don't know what kind of family he grew up in, but he just loved me as if I were his own son or baby brother. It was just an amazing relationship. And I think it was, for me, a life-changing relationship. And I developed a lot of confidence with composing because of him. So.
It seems like you've had some really wonderful male role models growing up. People talk about young men, particularly young men of African descent, and this need to have those strong role models. Sounds like you were one of the lucky ones in that regard. Anyway, so you are equally skilled in both jazz and classical. Did you play jazz growing up as well, or is that something you picked up later?
No, that's kind of interesting. I'd heard jazz. My parents were just amazing. Neither one of them were professional musicians, but my father loved music. He especially loved classical, and he used to play Bach and Mozart ever since I was probably in the womb, So, he was always, my mother played a little piano. She played some jazz, and she played classical too. So, and my father was a tenor. So when we lived in Liberia, for example, he was the tenor soloist for the Handel Messiah in Monrovia. They had a full orchestra. When I moved back to the United States years later, people asked me what living in Liberia was like. They would ask me, "Did you see any wild animals?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I did in the zoo. I'd go to the zoo like anybody else, there are great schools there. There are great music teachers and professors. And so I was really proud of that. But so I had heard jazz. In fact, I met Louis Armstrong when I was 8 years old. He came and gave a concert in Berlin. And Dad brought us backstage, and he looked like this gargantuan figure. I mean, he just seemed to tower over me. And years later, I met him when I was 21. I just happened to be at St. Louis at the airport. I got off the plane. I was walking through the corridor, and there's this little bitty guy. And I said, "Oh, my gosh, that's Louis Armstrong." I said hi to him. He said, "Hi, son. How you doing?" You know. And it just, I couldn't believe it. He had no bodyguards. I mean, if this were Paul McCartney or somebody, you know, there'd be, you know, fans all over the place and bodyguards all over. And he's just walking by himself. You know, this was probably like a year before he died. Little frail figure of a man, but he was just as sweet and friendly so I'd heard a little bit of jazz, but I didn't play any jazz. I didn't know any jazz, and I'm laughing because I do have a kind of crazy story. First, when I came to Boston, I didn't know jazz at all. What happened was, for the first time, I learned gospel music. I happened to go to 12th Baptist Church. I should tell you that story. Maybe a year before, my parents got divorced, years earlier. That's why we left Germany when I was 15. And so my mother lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and I went to visit her just before I was going to go to college. So I went to visit her, and she wanted to introduce me to some really wonderful African-American families, and one of them happened to be Ralph Abernathy's family. Wow. And so I was having dinner with the Abernathys, and her daughter was my age, Wandolin. I think she was the oldest. And she sang opera, and I was a composer. And so I was playing the piano when she was singing. And her mother came around in the dining room wherever the piano was. She said, "Boy, don't you know no gospel music?" And I was like, "No, ma'am, no, I don't. I was just playing classical. That's all I could play." And she kind of like whacked me on the back and said, "You need to go to such and such a church in Boston. And when you get to Boston, look up so-and-so, because that's how you're going to learn some gospel music." So anyway, long story short, I couldn't remember the name of the church. All she said, if I forgot the name, look up the big black church in Boston. So one day I asked the cab driver to take me to the big black church. And instead of this Methodist church, he took me to 12th Baptist Church in Roxbury, which is the black section of Boston. Yeah. And that's how I became Baptist, you know, from being a Catholic. I just fell in love with the music. And that's really kind of what helped me with jazz later on. I didn't really know jazz, but I absorbed gospel music like a sponge. I would stay in the church sometimes, 10 hours, sometimes 12 hours, from like 6 o'clock in the evening to 6 in the morning. And then go to school, you know. I just play and practice and get all these gospel licks, because I had never heard anything like this. I love the syncopations. I love the bass lines. I love the harmonies. I love the structures. It was just, I don't know, it just kind of was amazing. So that's kind of what was my foundation before I really got into jazz. I got into jazz out of desperation because I needed a job. When I finished school in 1982, or just before I finished school, I was looking for a job. And that summer, I auditioned to play in their restaurant. And the guy listened to me and said, "Play something for me." And so I played Misty. And I have this little keyboard here. I'll just do like a... And he said, "Hey, that's good. Can you play anything else?" And I said, "Sure." So I did this. He said, "I'll be doggone. Can you play anything else?" I said, "Oh, yes, sir." And I did. And then he said, "I'll be doggone." He said, "You got the job." And so that's how I got hired. So a little voice said, "Boy, you better learn how to play something besides Misty." So I learned 50 songs in 1 week.
Oh, good.
And so I just recycled a lot of music. And so some of them, it wasn't all jazz. Most of them were like show tunes from Broadway, you know, and I did a lot of that. And I played popular songs that were on the radio by Elton John or the Beatles or this or that. And I just mixed everything. And then eventually I started working more jazz into my repertoire. And what happened, so I worked there for like I was only supposed to be there 2 weeks. I ended up being there for 2 years. And in that time, in the 2 years, then I started to learn a lot of jazz. After that, I went to the Westin Hotel. They had just opened up in 1984, and I played for them for 6 years. And what really helped me, what really helped catapult my knowledge of jazz, I would go across the street from the Westin to the Copley Plaza, and there was a great jazz pianist named Dave McKenna, and he played. Everybody in Boston knew him in the 80s. He was like a legend. And he had played there for decades. And I would go in during my intermissions, during my breaks. I'd go and listen to him play, and I would just absorb everything I could. And I'd memorize what he would do, some of what he did, that I could memorize. And I'd come back to the Westin Hotel, and I would just play what I heard him play. And bit by bit, I just imitated a lot of people. Some of my favorites were Count Basie, and my all-time favorite was Art Tatum.
I knew that. I'm not the greatest connoisseur in some ways, but I was sure that you were inspired by Art Tatum just from listening to you.
Yeah, I could not get. In fact, I'm getting ready, and you're a part of this, by the way, young lady. I'm working on a brand new CD of jazz, and a lot of it is inspired by Tatum, but you said a couple of things to me that were very encouraging, and I really have you to thank for it. I'm just really grateful for your encouragement of playing jazz, because sometimes you go through phases where you think, am I really more called out to be a classical composer, or am I more called out to be like just a jazz musician, or, what do I really want people to remember me for? Mm-hmm. And one time I met Andre Previn when he came to Boston to conduct something, and I talked to him about it because I had listened to him. I didn't know he played jazz. He was phenomenal. He had some great jazz chops, and I listened to him, and I said to him, how do you, you're conducting now. You don't play jazz that much. He says, you do it all. All of it
Why not?
is great.
Why not?
And that's exactly what he said. Why not? He says, we do it all. And so, I appreciated that. So I wasn't totally discouraged anymore, and I kept doing it, and I still do it now. And as you know, I sing. I'm laughing because when I was at the Westin Hotel, I played piano there for 6 years. I never sang. I met a lot of people when I was there. I met Ringo Starr, I met politicians, I met all kinds of people. I won't name everybody, but I met a lot of very, very famous people. And I loved it when, they'd see me and I'd have dinner with this one or that one, or had a, cocktail with somebody. And, I enjoyed it very much, the whole experience of playing at the Westin. But after 6 years, I guess they got tired of me, and maybe I got tired of them, and they said, I think we need to make some changes, so we're going to let you go, and we're going to hire this lady because she sings. And I said, what? Well, I sing too. They said, well, you never sang here. I said, but that's what I do. I said, I didn't want to sing because I was in a big lobby, and I thought, I just thought that might be too much. So after I got let go at the Westin, then I started working at the Meridian Hotel. And I vowed to myself, wherever I end up playing, I am always going to sing, because that seems to be an asset. So, people like when you do the Nat King Cole and Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett and Mel Torme and all these different kinds of singers. And, so that's what I've been doing ever since then.
It's very clear our love is here to stay. Not for a year, never and a day.
Your CD, My Favorite Swings, is one of my family's favorites, and that includes my 20-year-old daughter and my 18-year-old son and my mom and everybody. No, because it's really outstanding.
Wow.
But you said when you were there, you told them, well, I sing too. Now, when did you start singing? For example, I heard, and I won't say the exact story correctly, but Bobby McFerrin said that when he forgot his first job, it was sort of like you in that he just kind of faked his way through it, and he didn't really know any songs, and then he just
Right.
kind of, faked his way. But were you singing all that time and not singing for them, or did you just say, well, I sing too, trying to save your job?
That's a good question. I mean, I sang in, well, first of all, I never considered myself a singer because my brother, who passed away a few years ago, had such a phenomenal voice that, I mean, he could just put anybody to shame. So I felt very intimidated. And it wasn't until, I think, my last year in high school in Washington. I moved from the prep school back to Washington, D.C., and I graduated from Woodrow Wilson High School in D.C., which was a great school for me because it was totally international. The music director was also a professor at Catholic University, and I sang in the choir. I didn't think I was that good, but she asked me to sing the tenor solo to the Haydn B-flat Mass. And so I worked and worked and worked. I listened to her. She helped me, and to my surprise and amazement and whatever, when I did the solo, when I took a bow, I got a standing ovation. And I thought, oh my goodness, I could do this the rest of my life. I'd love,
Wow.
This is like blowing me away. I mean, I really couldn't sing, at all. But then when I went to the conservatory, I sang in the choir, and my sight reading wasn't very good, but I made myself study. And in a year I could sight read almost anything, for tenor. And, so that's when I got more serious about it. And of course, being at the conservatory, I worked with all these great people. Lorna Cook-DeVaron was our conductor. Gunther Schuller was the president. And one year, Gunther took all of us, the choir and orchestra, to Paris and I think to Switzerland. Yeah. And so we did some masses. We did the mass and we did some other things while we were on tour. And it was just a fabulous experience. And we ended up, I think he had us do a mass in Paris, but then he ended the concert in Paris with an American in Paris with the orchestra, and everyone just loved it. It was a lot of fun. So I think that gave me a lot of confidence as a singer, but I still really never really thought about singing jazz songs until I think the Meridian Hotel sort of made me think about singing more often. I mean, I just did it for fun, but I didn't feel really comfortable singing, I think, when I was at the Westin for 6 years. But when they let me go, then I decided I'm gonna start singing, and because I don't want to be let go like that.
No, obviously not.
So fortunately, I've been able to work at various hotels. Of course, in Boston now, the piano thing is that's kind of gone. So I'm glad to be working at some of the other places that I work at. I play at different restaurants, so that's kind of nice.
One hopes that, the pendulum swings back in that regard, because obviously live music is different than recorded music. Or you're saying that they have live music, but it's a band?
I'm not sure because I don't go there. I mean, I don't really know what they do now.
Things. Yeah.
But if I play at a restaurant on the South Shore on Cape Cod, the thing that I love is that, you're catering to an older clientele who, a lot of people who've come to the Cape are from New York and they've retired on the Cape. And the songs from the 40s and 50s and 30s, they bring back lots of really wonderful memories for many of them. So I think now singing more than ever has been a godsend. It's been a wonderful experience to see the reaction that you can get. You can, see the love of those songs from other people. I think it's important.
I agree. When you feel that you are communicating something, like that what you're doing is really sharing and really touching people, that makes all the uncertainty of being a musician seem, at least temporarily worthwhile. But, okay, well, let me talk about your classical composing. We kind of got away from that.
Oh, yeah.
You have very eclectic collection of pieces. The one that we opened with was very, not really romantic 100%, but, it has that sort of feeling to it of something that, is, I hate to use the word relaxing. People have said classical music is relaxing, and I'm like, well, it depends. It's not relaxing at all.
Yeah, sometimes, right.
Yeah.
Do you want to know the story behind that? That piece, the Raindrops on the...
Sure.
Yeah. Because I grew up in Berlin, I had a very good friend. Her name was Susanna, and her parents and my parents used to hang out and party together and so forth and so on. And when I would visit them in Berlin, her father and mother were just wonderful to me. And around, I guess, 2009, 2010, both her mom and dad died. They died within a year of each other. Father died first and mom died. And in around 2011, Susanna came and visited us and stayed with us in Boston. And every night she would sit on the porch and read late at night. And she loved reading. And it was raining, and I came out and I said, "Are you okay?" You know, I said, "Yeah." She says, "Mom and Dad are here." And she said that whenever it rained, and we had 2 rose pots with roses, and so that's what inspired it. She said, "Whenever it rains, I feel like Mom and Dad are here. They're saying hi to me." And I thought, wow, this is pretty poignant, you know. So I wrote that really as a tribute to her mother and father, who I adored. They were just wonderful people, and they loved me like I was their son.
But you also have a love for Bartók, which I'm not saying he's never lyrical, because, you know, he has pieces that are very lyrical, or portions of pieces that are very lyrical. But some of the music is, I mean, I don't know if there's such a thing as avant-garde. It's really hard to, you know what I mean? Like, it's all been done in some way. But there's styles that, if I were going to use a word, less traditional, perhaps less accessible to people who are casual listeners. Can you list some of your favorite composers?
I have a whole lot of favorite composers. I think one of the life-changing experiences for me was being as a student at New England Conservatory and studying with different professors. But one professor I had, John Heiss, was one of the people that really introduced me to Stravinsky and Bartók, who I adored. I fell in love with the music for strings, celeste, and percussion early. You know, back then we had LPs, you know, none of these CDs at all. You know, we had records, and I'd stay in the library and listen over and over and over again. The thing about Bartók are his harmonies, or lack thereof, that some of the dissonances that he incorporates in his music. And also, of course, you know, if you listen to that particular piece, you know, the second movement of that, you hear a lot of percussiveness with the piano and, you know, rhythmic changes and everything. So I fell in love with that, as well as Stravinsky, and I was also introduced to the French Impressionism of Ravel and Debussy, and love Ravel very much. And, of course, Duruflé and Fauré and all of those. That was something that I also incorporate in my composition. Stravinsky always said a good composer isn't one who borrows it, he steals it. But, you know, I don't really like the term stealing, but I think what you do is you use the things that you identify with, and you make them yours, you know. So it's not a carbon copy of something someone else does. If you listen to Ravel's piano concerto, you know, you can hear the Gershwin influence. You can hear it in what he does.
The last movement and the concerto in F, I was thinking I should find out which one came first, because there's a lot of similarities between the last movement of the concerto in G of Ravel and the concerto in F of Gershwin. I should really know which one came first, but, you know, I don't have.
I don't remember, I mean, in a lot of my college music, you can hear the influence that Stravinsky played. You know, I love the percussive part in The Rite of Spring, you know. I mean, I love the syncopation, you know, and the accents and just the percussiveness.
And, you know, Stravinsky, actually, you should say which Stravinsky, because Stravinsky had so many different styles. Do you know that my piano teacher studied with Bartók? He didn't study composition, though.
Oh, wow.
And I could never pronounce, I always wanted to pronounce his name in the Hungarian way, but I could never quite master the sound. But it's like George Sándor. But his,
oh, my gosh.
He said Bartók never taught composition. He just taught piano.
Composition is hard I would think it would be hard to teach, because it's so visceral, it's so emotional, it's so in your spiritual fabric. You know, how do you define this or that? I mean, you know, I mean, I don't know. I think that we respond to what I know Brahms said something once about when you're composing, you have to have a certain craft, and that's true. But there's also a lot of feeling and depth of emotion that goes into it, too. And,
I mean, there's so many different ways to approach it. It's hard to say what's right or wrong. My son is a visual artist, and that's not something that I'm trained in at all. And there are things that, you know, I will see, and I'm thinking, oh, is that finished? That doesn't look finished. And then his art teacher chose, because he has this exhibition, and some of the things were in a sketchbook, and it didn't look to me like it was finished, but then all these people really liked some of the things. I'm like, what do I know? And that's the thing, it's purely, there's some people who will hear something and think something's boring or whatever, and now I may listen to Bach differently than when I listened to it before, and who can say that this is the greatest way to compose? But it's like a lot of things that should have some room for freedom, should have some room for different people responding differently to them. I mean, that's part of the reason I'm never a musical elitist in the sense of, there are people who talk about the good music and then the other music is inferior, and I think it depends on what you're trying to respond to. If I want to dance, there's certain things that don't make me want to dance, and I may love them in a certain thing, but, there can be a genius to Michael Jackson, to me, or Prince, or the way that they were able to construct songs that still, to me, sound wonderful and that I want to hear still just because they came out when I was a kid. But, I hear people who are current popular musicians who I feel, I don't know, if you can tap into something that humans respond to, even if it's a small group of humans, I think, why not? Well, within reason, of course.
Well,
Anyway.
I have two things to say to that. One is, first of all, I think your son is a genius. I've seen some of his artwork, and I'm very proud of him. And even though I don't know him, I identify a lot with some of the paintings that I've seen. And you should be very, very proud. And I think it's just a matter of time before his work is going to get recognized by a vast audience of people, And the other thing is that, Mozart once said that it's not intelligence, it's not imagination or the combination that makes genius. He said, genius is love, love, love. I love that. That is the soul of genius. And I also attribute it back to Stravinsky, because when you're saying, no, I'm not borrowing or stealing, it's like I'm loving this concept that you've put out there, but I'm also embracing it too, and I'm loving this thing, and I'm making something with it also, so to me, it's not stealing at all. It's just embracing it. I think Maurice Ravel once said, my passion, my love is always music. I can't remember exactly how he put it, but just that's his whole life is music,
Yeah.
And I think, to find that, and you can relate to people who demonstrate that. I mean, Dvorak, for example. I mean, he was ostracized because he said in, I think, the late 1800s, maybe even, the early 1900s, he said that he thought the future of American music was being able to embody the Negro, back then, the Negro melodies, incorporate the Negro melodies into composition, and he thought that would be a way of really, that was the foundation of American music. And there are a lot of people who didn't like that, but I've come to appreciate that statement. And I'll just say one more thing. When I met Dr. Eileen Southern, the late Eileen Southern, who was an ethnomusicologist at Harvard, and we spent some time together when I was doing some research on a project, and one of the things she encouraged me to do was never forget the importance of the Negro spiritual. And it is fundamental to, music composition. So that's sort of where I'm going, I think, in some of my future compositions. Although my first symphony, the first movement, was actually recorded in Bratislava. I haven't had the rest of them recorded, just the first movement. But that, and maybe I'm going to try to get it on YouTube from that. I don't know all the legal ways of channels to do that, but
I guess you need the permission of the ensemble, maybe.
Yeah, it was recorded by the Radio Orchestra in Bratislava. It was recorded like 20 years ago. The basic melodic motif is based on the field hours of slaves, which is intervals of minor thirds. And if you do some kind of research on with the Smithsonian Institute, you can hear and find some of these melodies because they weren't sung in words because the slaves didn't know English. So they were all like vowel utterances, yay, whoa, and they would just kind of utter those kinds of sounds, and we would think of that as just like nonsense, and but they make sense because they're expressing their despair through song, whether it sounds primitive to the classically trained ear or not. I mean, there's something to be learned from that, and that's what I was trying to incorporate in the first movement of my first symphony. And ironically, though, some friends of mine who listened to it said it sounds a lot like Rachmaninoff. I said, well, maybe he's got some black in him, you know.
Well, honestly, I mean, Rachmaninoff tried to express from the depths of his soul. So, I mean, I think that's one reason that music is such a great language, in that,
Absolutely.
you know, people have the same emotions and there may be different ways of expressing them, whatever your genre may be. But, you know, it's like if I say something in French, English, Spanish, or whatever, I mean, it's true that there's some languages that don't have words, particular things, and other languages do. But that kind of deep soul expression, I think, yeah, I really would love to hear it. But I had a quote at the beginning of my podcast that I originally was going to use, and then I changed it to something else. But the one I was originally going to use is actually by this guy who he got out of the Army. He was an African-American. I didn't know from the name of the person when I chose the quote. I just thought, oh, what a great quote. And he decided to change his name, and after he got out, and this is the quote, "To create art with all the passion in one's soul is to live art with all the beauty in one's heart." And his name is now Aberjani. And I thought, you know, as you were talking about that expression, I just think that really sums up.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, I really loved it too. So we haven't talked about Dorota.
I want to quote Liszt just for a second. One of the things that Liszt once said was, mournful and yet grand is the destiny of the artist. It's a combination of mournful and yet grand at the same time. We are the culmination of joy as well as sorrow, and we express that through composition. And, you know, he had moments of just pure, ecstatic joy. He was the Frank Sinatra of the 1840s. Everybody loved him, you know. Yeah. And yet he was also very sad because the woman that he wanted to marry, the Catholic Church wouldn't let him after, I think, they lived together for like 20 years. Yeah. So they had to end up, you know, he ends up being a priest out of resolving that this is the only thing I can do with myself, you know.
Yeah, he tried to get a lot of things out of his system before he went that route, but
I guess so.
But yeah, it's true that he was an interesting, I mean, I guess you say passionate in various ways figure, certainly. When I first heard that and heard his life story and that he ended up being, you know, the Abbé Liszt, but you
that's right,
that yearning in various ways. And the piece that I have at the end of the podcast is from the Petrarch Sonnet 104, which I think is one of the, you talk about yearning, and if you read the actual sonnet and the piece itself expresses it beautifully, and you can hear so much of Liszt.
I'll have to do that, yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. So listen, I do want to talk briefly anyway about this really avant-garde piece of yours, because the other ones that I'm focusing on, the jazz and the more romantic-sounding ones, as I said, the Raindrops and the Roses, are quite different. So can you tell me a little bit about Dorota, which means the pipes, correct?
The pipes, yes. When I was a student at New England Conservatory in the 70s, everybody back then used to call the conservatory the pipes. That was the nickname of the conservatory by most of the students. So that's where that came from. And it was my little sort of backward way of paying tribute to the New England Conservatory of the 1970s. Which was very wild and crazy, and I mean, it was a wonderful place to be, and everybody was out of the box and just wanting to do their own thing, and not everybody, but, you know, many people who felt that their music should challenge the status quo. Why should we write and compose in conventional kinds of ways? And, you know, the more avant-garde we could be, the better. So, that's kind of what led to my composition of Dorota and the pipes. And it was meant to be dissonant and a little silly at the same time.
If you're pushing the envelope to push the envelope, no one will know that you're pushing it unless you go out there. And this is like an absolute tangent, that my grandmother actually went to the New England Conservatory. I don't know if I ever told you that. My grandmother was a pianist. She was a pianist, and she attended the New England Conservatory in the 30s. And at the time, she earned a little extra money in the 30s, working as a maid for a white family or whatever. And So she was supposed to eat after she'd served everybody, but that wasn't the way she was raised in Bermuda. So she would take the best food to begin with and serve them after that. But one day they called her in when she was, eating, and she wasn't supposed to have started eating yet, and her mouth was full and whatever. So she didn't stay in that job for all that long. But anyway, yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah. But anyway, okay, let me round this up because I'm enjoying this conversation, but I want to try to keep it.
I know we got to watch the time. I know.
Yeah. But that's fine. So how did you decide, or I guess it's not you decide to study theology. You feel called to study theology. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of things?
Yeah, because of my experience in the Baptist Church in Roxbury, I got more serious about my relationship with God. And, of course, I have 2 degrees, a master's and a doctorate. But I believe, like Bach, that I also believe that music is to give God glory. And this is very interesting. I mean, because I play jazz, I've met a lot of jazz musicians and various kinds of artists. I remember one time I met the late Ruth Brown, who was doing a concert in one of the hotels I worked at, and she came downstairs to the restaurant that I was playing at, and so she sat down and listened to me play, and during my break I sat down and talked with her, and she told me that she really believed in God very deeply, and how, she feels that all music glorifies God, no matter what, and that whenever she would sing jazz, she wanted to do it the very best she could for God, because God had put her here and given her life, and I like that. I like that philosophy. So I've seen how music can bring people together, and especially in church, I really believe that the civil rights movement would never have succeeded as it has without the incorporation of gospel music. People like Mahalia Jackson and others that brought people, that galvanized the movement through song. I think for me, I guess you're talking about your grandmother. My grandmother was deeply religious, and I think some of that I inherited from her. She was just an amazing human being. She prayed and read the Bible every day, and she really lived it. I mean, she had the most kind, generous, caring, loving spirit that I've ever seen in my whole life. So I think that's kind of something that played a role in my own life, and so I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know. You know what? I start quoting people, and I should know who say these things, but there was someone who said something along the lines of preach the gospel at every turn, and if necessary, use words. So, you have these people who have just this spirit, and you see where it comes from. I mean,
that might have been St. Francis of Assisi.
Was it Francis? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So my great-grandfather founded like 5 AME churches in Bermuda, which is where my mom and my grandmother, to whom I'm referring, is from. Yeah, so there's that tradition of, my grandmother being a pillar of the church and my mom being heavily involved. And I think if you see people who seem like they're hypocrites in that regard, then it pushes you away. And if you see people who seem like there are things that have made them in some way special in the way that they add comfort to other people's lives or do things that inspire and add light to other people's lives, then I could see why you are drawn to something like that. And if that's what gave her that, I could see why you would want to share that with other people and be available to it yourself. That makes perfect sense to me. In other words, that was a good answer.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Let me just share a quick one with you. I was a student in New England Conservatory, and our choir sang with the Boston Pops with Arthur Fiedler, and we were singing the background to a Lincoln Portrait. And the narrator happened to be none other than Marian Anderson.
Wow.
And after the concert, because we were all in the first half, I went backstage. I spent an hour with Marian Anderson. And, of course, because my father was in the Foreign Service and he had experienced racism and she had experienced racism, she wasn't able to sing at one of the concert halls in Washington. And so Eleanor Roosevelt allowed her to sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So anyway, I went backstage, I talked to her, I said, Miss Anderson, how did you feel about that? Weren't you angry? Weren't you upset? And she put her arm around me. She said, son, sit down. Let me just tell you something. There is so much good. There is a God. There are so many wonderful people. We need to try to think more about the good and the good in one another. By the time she was finished with me, I was in tears. I was crying all my eyeballs out. I just felt like, oh my goodness, she was just so the epitome of love.
Well, we need that message more than ever as far as looking for the good in people, really focusing on the good and really searching hard in some cases for the good. If you have that attitude, I guess you will find it. This leads me easily to my next question, which is one of the last ones I have for you, which is, what comes to mind when you think of the word beauty?
Nature. When you think about all the composers, most of them got inspired by nature. Brahms would take walks. Beethoven would take walks. I love looking out my window where I compose every morning, and I see the trees, and I get inspired by it. Mahler secluded himself in a spot in Vienna often where he could just compose and just observe nature. So I think I would say nature. Of course, there are many levels of beauty. There's the human spirit and love that we see in one another. That's also beauty as well. Seeing people reunite. Like I had the experience a year ago of going back to Berlin for a class reunion and seeing some people I hadn't seen in many, many years. And just that feeling of reuniting together, with others and that love, I think that's beauty too.
Absolutely. Okay. This is another question I'm asking everybody. Can art change the world?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think you look at the effect of something like the ballets of Stravinsky, The Rite of Spring and Petrushka, and how some of the audiences didn't like that and liked them in the beginning. People didn't even like Mahler in the beginning. Some of them were incensed by the third movement of the Mahler First Symphony, that morbid version of Frère Jacques in a minor key. They hated that. And now we look at that as, wow, and then now we understand more of his life. It was an expression of who he was. So I think absolutely art changes. It may take time, but, that's the beauty of it, You know what Brahms once said? Brahms said, if you study Bach, you've studied everything. That's all you need, You'll find everything in Bach. And that was from Brahms, and we're still listening to Bach today. And, it changes. I think, I do.
Okay, so for people who are wondering how they'd find out where you're performing or how they could buy your CDs, how can they find you?
Oh, dear. I don't know. I have no answer. Because
you have a website.
I have a website, but I don't really... that's something I'm going to have to figure out. I don't know how to put my CDs, on a website for sale.
But if they contact you, you have the contact information on the website.
Yeah, they can contact. Yes, if they're interested, they can write.
And you're putting things on YouTube now, right? Those are things that are also on your CDs. And I'm going to hopefully record a CD of your music. So when I do that, I will definitely post it somewhere and let people know. So,
and I'm hoping that your son will provide me with the painting for the drawing for the cover of the CD. I'm still
works.
Okay, good. That's wonderful.
Yeah, no, I didn't forget that idea. Okay, well, in conclusion then, I wanted to play one last chording, and the one I chose was For Elise. Can you tell me about that? Not Für Elise, which I have to admit is my least favorite Beethoven piece ever, but For Elise, which I like much better.
Well, Elise was an acquaintance. She passed away around 2009. She was Jewish, but then she had also later converted to Christianity. That was around the time I met her. And she would come to my former church that I was at, and she would pray for the elephants. She loved the elephants and felt that people were exploiting them, taking their tusks, and that was something that she was very passionate about. And I thought she was a very fascinating person, and but she had a very advanced stage of cancer, but she was a very unique person, I think, for the reasons I've shared, just giving her life to all these different causes that she really believed in. She was very much her own person. And even while she was, dying from cancer, she was very upbeat,
Wow.
I mean, most people would be very depressed, and she was, I think one time she made a statement, I'm going to see Jesus one day. I'm going to see God, and I'm happy. I'm not sad,
Wow.
And she died a couple months later, and I told her, I said, one day I'm going to write you a piece. I don't think she really liked that idea, because it kind of reminded her of her mortality.
Oh.
But I did anyway, and I performed it in a concert, and everybody really liked it. And that's when I decided I was going to record it.
Yeah.
That's why I recorded. Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, on that particular CD, that's the only one that I played on. Other friends of mine played my other pieces.
Glad that you wrote it, because it's a lovely piece.
Well, thank you.
Okay, well, I could ask you more questions, but I think at this point I should probably call this conversation to a close. Thank you so much, Dr. Geoff Hicks.
The theme music for Finding Beauty is Symphony of Light, written and performed by Kiana Corley, with assistance on the cello from Allegra Banks. Rusty Banks was the producer. Right now, you're listening to Liszt's Petrarch Sonnet No. 104, performed by yours truly. You can hear the rest of it on my CD, Music from the Novel Letting Go, available on CreateSpace and Amazon. If you're interested, you can check me out at mariacorley.com or mariasworld.us. You can also find me on Twitter at Maria Corley or YouTube. My recordings are available through Albany or Amazon. My novel, Letting Go, is available on Smashwords, CreateSpace, Barnes & Noble, and Amazon. Or drop me a line on my site, and I'll send you a signed copy. I want to leave you with one more quote. Do your little bit of good where you are. It's the little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world. Desmond Tutu. Have a beautiful day.